Welcome, Sunday TMBS. Thanks, everybody. With super producer Matt Leck here. Second part of our conversation on class consciousness, false consciousness, the Teamsters, where we go from here. My buddy Dino Guastella, who is director of operations at Teamsters Local 623. I'm considering giving myself that title for TMBS as well. Director of operations. That sounds very official.
Yeah, it's a good title. My principal officer liked it because the short for it is the DOP, Dino the DOP.
Dino the DOP. How did you get into this work, man?
So to go way back, I grew up in a working class family. My father's an electrician, my mother's a hairdresser, and I got lucky enough to go to college. And after college, I sort of learned, a lot of the politics that I have today. And so I immediately looked for a way to basically be a part of the labor movement. So I started in the AFL-CIO. I was a mobilizer and organizer for the AFL-CIO in southeastern Pennsylvania. And then after that, I worked for the nurses union. And so I sort of started out with this idea that, the labor movement is the institution that is the most important, and we have to help build it. And then, I knew the guys from 623 when they were running for office, and when they took office in a reform movement that was pretty impressive. They were looking for somebody in their front office to, work and build the union, and I was more than happy to say I would love to do that. And so I decided to jump on board with them, and I've been working with them since.
Awesome. Can you give us? I didn't warn you, so it doesn't have to be. I'm not talking like any type of academic presentation or precision, but I realize I think there's a broad theoretical understanding of the importance of labor, and then I think there's a huge variation in kind of basic knowledge base about labor as institutions in the United States today, and that also reflects, these bigger changes. You get the sense you can read some book about the Kennedy administration or something, and it doesn't have to be from any type of left perspective, and you notice that the union leaders are national figures. They're known in the White House. They're sitting on economic councils, and probably most Americans, and not just, Hoffa with, as a kind of dynamic, controversial figure, but, right. A Walter Reuther or whoever, that these people are known. Can you just give us a sense broadly, what are the main union organizations today? What is it, 10% of the private sector? How much of the public sector? What's the difference? What is an independent union versus being affiliated with one of the two major ones?
Right.
Just give us a kind of broad outline of that.
So I think the best way to approach this is like in a historical approach. So if we go back to what you're talking about, the 60s, right, and the Kennedys, at that time, the union movement was an institution in every American's lives, right? By the mid-40s, roughly 1 in 3 American workers was in a union. So unions were not this special interest group that right-wing politics now sort of calls them. They were the part of the fabric of American life. And as a result of that, things like the AFL-CIO, which is the largest union federation in the country, were a major part of every political decision that was made from the 40s through the 70s, right? And the things that changes with neoliberalism is becomes a strong divorce between the unions as a political force and their shop floor power. So as they start to get decimated by anti-union laws and by really aggressive employers, the union movement itself shrinks, right? It becomes less influential in the state, and it becomes less influential on the shop floor. And as a result of that, the popular consciousness around unions has really deteriorated. Like when I went to college, I went to a public school in Philly called Temple University. And just 10 years ago, when I was in school, most people at that university, because it was a working class school, most people at that university knew what a union was. I guarantee you today, if I were to walk into any classroom and say, do any of you have union member families? Maybe 1 or 2 would raise their hand. And that shows you how decimated the union movement has become. Now, today, there is some signs of life, right? We've seen higher strike rates now than we have since the 1980s. And that's really, really encouraging, right? And that's across really broad sectors, right? From logistics to teaching to nursing, across the board, we're seeing an increase in union militancy, which is a good thing. I think it's a sign that the labor movement is sort of shaking off its the struggles that it's had and starting to move forward. But institutionally, we're still very weak. And I think that the foundations of the union movement, which were these mass organizations funded by dues and determined by members, have become much weaker internally. And they are now, some of the biggest unions are now, they spend more money on political decisions than they often do on organizing their own members. There's a lot more emphasis on basic survival tactics, in other words. And I don't I want to be clear. I'm not one of these people who says it's their own fault because they didn't think well enough, right? It's defensive. Right. And it's defensive because they've been on the defense for so long. And so their strategies and tactics are weak. They're from a position of weakness, right? What we need to do, I think, is engender the kind of working class spirit that created these organizations to revivify, right? To bring them back to life. And you're starting to see that here and there. And I think in our lifetimes, we're going to see a real resurgence in the labor movement. And it's really important. And I just want to say the reason it's important is the classic Marxist example is true, right? The reason workers' organizations are important is because workers can strike. And by striking, they can shut down production, they can change the world, right? But from a political perspective, there's another thing that often gets left out, which is union organizations are the basis for working class politics, because it's on the shop floor that workplace grievances get translated to political demands. And it's on the shop floor that a political subject known as the worker is formed and fortified, right? So you go into any Teamster shop in the country and you will immediately notice that Teamsters identify as Teamsters. They think of themselves as Teamsters. They understand their brothers and sisters as brothers and sisters in arms, as workers fighting for a better life, right? That kind of class consciousness is really hard to build outside of the workplace organizing that is necessary. So yes, the striking and the structural part is important, but also the consciousness part, creating and engendering a political subject that thinks of themselves and acts as a worker first and foremost. I'm a worker. I'm going to defend my worker brothers and sisters. That's who I am, right? That kind of consciousness can't be built in my opinion, it can't be built anywhere else other than on the shop floor and with a group of workers who are consistently fighting the real class struggle against their bosses. So unions are important from every level of the socialist project, in my opinion. And without it, we don't have the class basis that we need to really change American politics.
Yeah, I think that's just undeniable. And I especially because I really like, and people maybe misinterpret me sometimes, when I criticize moralism, I'm not criticizing ethical commitments to things. I mean, one hand, I criticize moralism because I do think that there is this, generally demented, puritanical, middle class, horribly toxic and delusional culture on the liberal left that needs to be completely uprooted. But I also think it's even in positive ways that the jet engine fuel of people with good intentions being concerned about the well-being of others, which is totally a positive thing. I mean, empathy is a building block, right? It's certainly not sufficient and never will sustain the kind of material and strategic capacity to actually have a counterweight to capital class power.
Right. Well, and the other thing on that note, the difference between a working class consciousness among a rooted sort of class force and a moralistic liberal consciousness is the moralistic liberal consciousness says you have to already agree with these moral precepts in order to be on our team. The working class consciousness flips that on its head and says it doesn't matter what your preconceived prejudices might be. What matters is you're in a war right now. Yep. And do you want to make sure that your employer actually does something for you? Or do you want to be left out in the cold? Do you want your union to fight to get you your job back? Or do you want to be left out in the cold? That difference that's the difference between a working class army that's going to war, going to battle every day against their employer, and a moralistic liberalism that in their heads, they're fighting for something, but there's nothing really behind it other than words and a feel-goodness, right? And the other thing you said, which I think is important, is working class consciousness is about fighting for me and my brothers and sisters. Liberal consciousness is about fighting for some other abstract group that I think exists, that I maybe know, but probably doesn't go to my school, probably doesn't live in my neighborhood, and certainly doesn't work with me. But they exist, and I feel bad for them, and I want to help them in some way. And those are just two totally different conceptions of politics.
And I would say too that the irony to me, and everybody knows that I'm a Lula stan, but there's many examples of this, that like by that kind of working class consciousness actually engenders much more durable and rich and filled out emotional landscape of empathy, solidarity, and love that isn't just about people ticking different boxes and who's in and who's out and, redefining subjectivities. It really is like in the muck with your fellow complicated human beings fighting over very clear struggles and very basic dividing lines. And then that's the launching off point in which those capacities actually grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Lula is one of the best examples of the PT in general is one of the best examples of this. I mean, people don't realize it today, but when the PT was first starting out, that nobody thought they had any chance of even winning regional governments. You know what I mean? This idea that in Brazil, you're going to form something like a European Labor Party, give me a break. Like, this is impossible. Brazilians aren't that way. The political structure militates against it. There's no way. And yet the consciousness among PT voters today is like unthinkably strong. It's so strong that there's a whole ideology against just being a PT voter. That's the kind of real political rootedness that comes out of a real working class movement. And you just can't find it outside of, like, it is one of the things that makes socialist politics worth living for, because it exists nowhere else. There's no other political movement that has that dynamism, that has that strength other than the workers' movement. Historically, the world over, wherever you go, it's the workers' movement that gives, political life in modern times, real humanism, real solidarity.
So to cultivate that consciousness, we'll get to some of the more practical stuff and talk about your work too, for sure. And I'm very confident. This is our second conversation. I think these are going to be the first of many. I hope you'll come on regularly because we need to have more of this kind of conversation for sure. But when we talk about cultivating that consciousness, if we were to say, for the last 40 years with the war on labor, and there's numerous, I think we actually probably have a better sense of the effects of globalization and capital flows and all that type of thing. And you could speak to that. But ideologically, if on the right wing, there was this idea that unions were parasitic and lazy, and on the neoliberal lane, this is a less filled out thought, but I always think of the idea of, the Teamsters backed Nixon in 72, and a couple of them punched some protesters. And so, boom, there you go. Completely, look, Walter Reuther, like cutting checks and working closely with the civil rights movement. There's a much deeper history here that does not get told. But those two basic trajectories of not only opposing unions, but of saying that it's not that real global grounded humanism you're just talking about, but that it's parasitic, insular, and on the neoliberal side, reactionary.
Right. Yeah. And I think the neoliberals will also say it's a fetter on growth, right? Like, it stops innovation, it stops all this kind of stuff. Well, look, the truth is that most Americans today like unions. And the reason they like unions for the first time in a long time is because they don't have them, which is that's the depressing part about it, right? Like, my wife's a chef. She works in a kitchen, and she would love to have a union. You know what I mean? Like, she would love to have something that can basically protect her on the shop floor level. And most, especially working class Americans, recognize the need for that kind of protection. The propaganda war against the union movement was devastatingly effective, but it was effective precisely because the capital war was already won, right? Like, by decimating the unions on the shop floor, these things became foreign, alien things to most Americans. You can't demonize a union movement when 1/3 of Americans are a part of it. Because as soon as the business class says your union is terrible, then you show up to a union meeting and you say, nah, that doesn't seem right. You know what I mean? But when the union movement becomes weaker and becomes sort of retreats to a smaller portion of the population, then the business community can come in and say, look, they're all parasites, they're evil, they're nepotistic, they're corrupt, yada, yada, yada. And it becomes more believable for especially non-union working class people because they don't have any real connection to it. So it's kind of a chicken or egg problem, which is like, until we really have the basis for a strong unionization drive in this country to reunionize this country, it's hard to fight back against the propaganda war. But at the same time, even the propaganda war right now isn't doing very well because most Americans have favorable opinions of unions, which is really remarkable if you consider, and it's another truism of Marxism, of materialism, right? Like if your material foundations are so weak, nobody can convince you that reality isn't reality. And I think that's what we're seeing right now is that like many workers are saying, yeah, I understand that they tell me they're nepotistic or corrupt or whatever, but at the end of the day, I would much rather have a grievance process and a shop steward than have what I have right now, which is at will employment, and I could get told to go home at any time. You know what I mean? And so I think for us, the challenge is like being able to make sure that the union movement's sort of propaganda image is not so tarnished that people are afraid of them. But the real work is going to come from organizing on the shop floor and being able to organize workers into new unions and into a big unionization drive across the country.
So big picture, I mean, everything from the work that you're doing in Philadelphia to, I mean, we talked to a student organizer who's supporting what's happening. This would have been 2 days ago by the time this is released, but May 1st, there's going to be some national sit-ins and strikes, Amazon, Target, FedEx. How does it happen? What are you thinking about? What's the plan? What's the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff has to happen with the workers themselves, right? Like, yeah. One of the big challenges is it's very difficult to helicopter in to a workplace.
Right.
And that's for all the reasons that you wouldn't want somebody helicoptering into your living room and telling you what to do. You know what I mean? Right. And so it has to start with the workers themselves in these industries. And I think Amazon is actually really ripe, to be honest. I think that because Amazon is such a monster company, and the contradictions of working for such a behemoth company in a country that basically valorizes your boss every day, it engenders a level of fightingness among those workers to say, we're done. We're not taking this anymore. We're going to do something here. And I think the Amazonians United and all of that stuff is really promising for the union movement at large, because these big behemoths, I mean, the labor movement has been trying to organize Walmart for decades. We've been trying to organize all of these warehouse workers for decades. And the challenge is always that if you don't have the shop floor strength, the boss is going to beat you to the punch. They're going to indoctrinate the union, the members. They're going to stop the members from, congregating. They're going to throw up all sorts of, barriers to them.
Monitor their internal communication. I mean, so exactly. The Amazon stuff is very aggressive.
Yeah. But that stuff can be overcome if there's a strong enough group, right? And the coronavirus thing gives us a particular opportunity, right? Because all of these Amazon workers are being told by the federal government that they're essential workers. And yet they're being told by their boss that they're basically disposable. Right. And that dynamic is not lost on them. You know what I mean? They see that other essential workers, especially essential workers with unions, are getting proper equipment. They're getting attention. They're getting safety and sanitation regulations. Yet the most wealthy corporation in the country can't afford to do that for them. It seems like a powder keg. And I think that this coronavirus thing, if there's any silver lining to it, which it's a very dark time, but if there's any silver lining to it, seeing Amazon workers start to develop a real strategy for how they fight back is a really good thing for the American working class.
What about the regulatory landscape? I mean, what is the relevance? And I think this goes back to the sympathy. I agree with you. When I was in did an event in Massachusetts a couple of days before Super Tuesday for Bernie. And we were driving in from Rhode Island to the event in Boston. And there was this, and actually I don't want to overcredit myself, but I never totally counted Biden out. And it was funny because there's this giant Biden board, like electronic thing. And of course, I think it was probably a fireman's local. And it was like, because who else?
Right.
Certainly not the campaign. Not the campaign. The campaign's not going to do this. And there's no energy on a grassroots level. But I thought of it, and I was thinking to myself, like, I don't know the ins and outs of all of these unions' leaderships, and I'm sure there is some structural problems, maybe, but I don't begrudge these people saying, let's pick the safest course of action possible and carve out our little thing. When Amazon was going to come to Queens, there was a couple of building trades. Of course they wanted in. Those are some great jobs. Those are actually some of the only actual jobs for working people that the thing would have actually delivered, right? So I totally get all of that, and I understand. And, that's the big thing, like in this election, right? I mean, it gets depressingly narrow, but people say, like, hey, who is a Democrat versus a Republican going to point on the NLRB? Right. So I want to bring in, I get what you're pointing to, if I understand you correctly, is that this new wave of just people just need to get out and do it, regardless, certainly, of what's happening in our political system and in media or wherever else. This needs to come literally from the shop floor up. And then on the other hand, there is, there's the material consequences of the policies that have been waged against it. So can you give us a sense of that terrain as well?
I mean, on the Biden thing, and I think this is in general, I think a lot of leftists get annoyed with the labor movement for endorsing milquetoast Democrats, for not being left-wing enough, et cetera. But you have to understand the difference between the labor movement and an ideological movement is that the labor movement they have members to respond to, right? And if you have a Republican in government, the Republican is going to try to destroy the NLRB. They are going to try to get rid of your dues money. And so as an institution, they are an existential threat to the labor movement at every time, right? And the challenge is that we're in this weird interim period where there's a new kind of left-wing policy agenda that is being expressed at the political level. But the inertia of the old system of defensiveness is still there. And so I think many unions have a very basic survivalist instinct right now. And until they can be, and the onus is on us. And this is the thing that annoys me about leftists who blame the unions. The onus is on us. We have to prove we can govern. We have to prove we can deliver something before the labor movement's going to turn around and say, yeah, we're all in. Because the labor movement's perspective is like, yeah, liberal Democrats promised us the world and they never get elected and they never do anything for us. You know what I mean? Like Obama was a classic example of that, right? He had promised EFGA. He had promised he was going to do so much for the labor movement, and they got bupkis, right? So when that happens time and time and time again, your labor movement is going to say, let's just try to get the crumbs that we can get. Let's just try to maintain and survive, because we know that this Republican administration is going to kill us. So I really think you can't blame the labor movement. You have to, it's on us as leftists to prove that we can govern, to prove that we can make change in order for the labor movement to flip and say, yeah, we're on board. We're all in for that type of politics. And you look before, like FDR, for instance, the labor movement would donate to both political parties, right? They would say, whoever's going to give us a little something, we're going to try to play a transactional game with, right? Now that makes sense from a rational perspective. If you don't have a labor party, if none of your guys are in there, you're going to say, I'm going to play ball with both teams to figure out what the best deal I can get for my members is. It wasn't until FDR got in there and the CIO really pushed a real strong left-wing agenda that suddenly the labor movement transformed itself and said, we are going to be fighting on behalf of the Democratic Party to win government, to be the governing partner in the Democratic Party's real push for change. right? But it didn't happen because the Democrats made good promises. It happened because they delivered. And when you can deliver, that's when you can get a big chunk of the labor movement to say, yep, we're all in.
How can we prove it?
So I think the key is we have to start winning. We have to start winning stuff, right? And we haven't yet. We're still very young and green.
Yep.
If we can start winning stuff, even on the state level. You can start to build relationships with local unions and with union federations that start to show, okay, this path to politics isn't crazy. In fact, it's doable. And what they promised us is real, and we can make it happen. The other thing I think is we have to start running working class candidates. I mean, it's one of the frustrating parts about this current crop of left-wing activism is we're not seeing steel workers running for Congress, right? We're not seeing electricians running for State House. What we're seeing is a lot of really ambitious, and I don't take any credit from them. I think they're great people. Basically professional class, D-class professional class people who have left-wing ideas running for these positions. But if we can get working class people to start running for those positions on a left-wing platform, the unions are going to be behind. The unions want their members in government. They want their members to be the people who they have relationships with in the State House, in city council, in Congress, right? But we have to do the work of being able to actually generate that kind of political leadership from the class and from the union movement, such that we have candidates who are real working class champions from, of, and by the working class. That, to me, I think can really change the minds of a big chunk of the labor movement.
Yeah, it's another reason why on some level I've talked about Lula a lot is I just think, again, there is a very obvious example of, look, obviously there is the part that, who knows why particular individuals are unusually charismatic, and Obama is unusually charismatic, and Bill Clinton and Lula is certainly unusually charismatic, and Trump in his own way is bizarrely charismatic. But attached to Lula specifically is that it not only the charisma, but it's in some ways it's a redefined charisma, because it's brilliant strategic mind, but not in the vernacular of the managerial class, which it just isn't that appealing for that many people.
Right.
It just really isn't. And attached to that too, one of the things that always struck me, and I think when you talk about proving to people, is I went to a presentation. I think it was actually an AFL-CIO guy who was advocating on behalf of Lula. And I think it is important to remember that even the organizations that can, be very defensive and appear quite conservative, they're still doing some pretty extraordinary work, even on really important areas of international solidarity.
Find me a liberal Democrat who will defend Lula, right?
Exactly.
You will find way more supposedly conservative AFL-CIO people who will be willing to defend Lula than you would a liberal Democrat.
100%. And what this guy said was that, when Lula would come to Washington, he'd obviously meet Bush or Obama first, president-to-president meeting, and then he'd go to AFL-CIO headquarters. And he even specifically said, hey, when Brazil has a massive meat producer and uses plants in the States, guys have a problem, give me a call. And they did, and he did. Right. It wasn't an empty thing. And that consciousness is irreplaceable.
Right. And you can't, and that's the true internationalism of working class politics that, Lula better than most people, this is going to turn into a Lula love fest. But
that's great. I love it.
Lula better than most people really understood, he's rare in so many ways, but in that particular quality, to understand that when he goes abroad, even to, the metropole of capital, his allegiance is to the American working people and not to, the American political class. That kind of consciousness does not come out of a feel-good seminar that you learn. That kind of consciousness comes out of the fact that he fought like hell in strikes where people's legs were broken, where he, just went head to head with the biggest capitalists in Brazil and with an international system that was stacked against him. He knows who his real base is. And it's never going to be the Obamas and Bushes, as much as they want to deal with him and everything like that. But it is going to be the working people of every country. To me, the only way we really get to the next step in this this movement in the United States is by having a kind of a real working class movement like that, where our leaders, our working class leaders, are people like that who immediately, instinctively relate to working people. That's their first relation, right? Is to working people, and not to the professional class, and certainly not to the political classes of any elite country.
And it's funny because when you say that, I hear, some people almost, they get like anxious, like, oh, so you mean that there isn't students and there isn't, and of course there's intellectuals, there's students, there's professionals. I mean, the PT again is another great example of this. There's liberation theologists, everybody, including in leadership roles. But the base is the worker.
Right.
How else can you, again, it's just not viable that you do it any other way. As the last question, and again, I hope you'll come back on again soon. When you talk to older members in unions and kind of rank and file who say, I think of my grandmother actually, who's retired, but she was in a union. This is an amazing example actually of a union that she could basically be retired in Florida for pretty much all of my adult life as somebody who sold tickets at Penn Station. That should tell you something. Not living in any way extravagantly, but fine and able to be in a nice warm place. She likes Bernie, but I think Biden, the one we would all know, is just a kind of superficial understanding of electability, which we've talked about, problematic, whatever. But this, on one hand, this serious institutional memory of FDR and Truman and things like single payer, it's like weird that we haven't already done that. There's nothing radical. It's obvious. Every American needs to have it. And then on the flip side, there is that just like, yeah, Bernie's a great guy, but I don't know what the hell you kids are talking about. And I'm wondering, when you talk to, like, is that what you find in general, that on one hand, there's a big receptivity to the political ideas, but there is just, I guess it's another version of the same skepticism you were talking about most, about who's running and can it actually win?
I mean, I think that our political program is running well ahead of our strength to implement that political program. And so worker skepticism is not unwarranted, right? Like,
right.
It's perfectly rational for somebody to say, yeah, I would love Medicare for all, but it's never going to happen. Like, their entire political lives has shown that they're right and we're wrong. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, the other side of this, which I do think might be, I'm skeptical of saying it's generational, but it is clear that younger workers are more willing to take risks than older workers. And I think that might be like a life cycle process, but it also is the fact that younger workers just don't see much of a future, right? Older workers are in a position of saying, it sucks, the system sucks, but like, I got to just retire. I just got to make it, just got to get through it, Whereas younger workers are like, retirement? They're like Social Security, you know what I mean? Like, they're seeing that those things are kind of fantasies for them. And so I think there's something of a divide among, and it's not, when I say younger workers, I mean like under 45. I don't mean like teenagers, right? I'm talking like anybody under 45 sees that there's something wrong with what's going on. Whereas if you're older and you're kind of established, it's easier to say, I just got to get through it. I just got to get through to my retirement. I just got to get my Social Security, my pension, and my Medicare, and I'll be okay. If you're a younger worker, those things they're not even promised to you. You know what I mean? And so you're more willing, I think, to take some risks and say, you know what, I'm going to go all in for this insurgent candidate or this, seemingly pie in the sky idea, because what else do I have? Just sit back and watch everything dry up and not have a job in a few years?
There it is. I mean, there's the opportunity borne out by fucked up necessity, but there it is. Dino, appreciate your time. Everybody, there's going to be links to the article in Jacobin, as well as the great teach-in, stay at home that you did for Jacobin YouTube channel as well. And and really, I mean, just like Adolph's been coming on about once a month, I hope you'll be back on again in another couple of weeks. I want to try to start to plot this stuff out a little bit, and I think this is where the terrain is.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Michael. And
man, I really appreciate it. That was great.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody.
That was awesome. All right, brother. I will.